Welcome to everyone who's come along to this Zoom online launch of the excellent new book on ageing and gerontology, Critical Questions for Ageing Societies by Gemma Carney and Paul Nash. My name is Neil Briscoe and I'll be your host for today. Good afternoon to everyone joining us from the UK and Europe, and good morning to everyone joining us from the United States. Now, this is an excellent book, both a textbook and a very readable modern science book, delving into the depths of gerontology, the theories of aging, of how we age and how we can age better. For today's session, I'll be comparing, we'll be chatting about the book, we'll be learning about the background to the book, both in terms of its academic background and in terms of actually the physical methods of sitting down and creating it and getting it out to print. But before we do that, I will say there will be a Q&A session after we've spoken to the authors, Gemma Carney and Paul Nash. For anybody who wants to ask a question, you're more than welcome to. I will turn to you when it is time to. In the meantime, would you mind putting your audio on mute? Because obviously on Zoom, audio can cut across different streams and it makes it a bit difficult to hear people. You're more than welcome to leave your video on, although you might want to turn it off if you wish to cough or sneeze or do anything else. However, let's get straight into the meat of this. We're going to go directly to Paul Nash, who's joining us live from Los Angeles. Paul, can you tell us a bit more about the book, a bit more about the academic background to the book?
Good morning, Neil, or good afternoon. Thank you so much for comparing this event, and thank you everyone, as Neil said, for turning up. So I'm the boring one out of the two, unfortunately, out of myself and Gemma, and I'm going to give you a bit of the background about how we came up with the idea for the book and really what's included for those of you who haven't managed yet to get a copy. If you haven't got a copy of the book yet, don't panic, there are plenty available. So really what happened is Gemma and I have got quite a broad background in terms of teaching. And we have been approached by students across the years with multiple questions, some of which obviously we can't broadcast. But what we did is compiled some of the core questions that have been asked us around topics on ageism, retirement, gender differences, and politics throughout aging. And what we thought was, wouldn't it be great if you could get all of these in one place? So we know there are some fantastic books out there on things like cultural gerontology, on loneliness, and the Policy Press has got a fantastic range of books, but they're all quite specific. So what we wanted to do was get a textbook that students could access to give them an overview of some of these critical areas and update some of the thinking with both our own interpretations, but also some of the newer theories that are coming out. So the book itself isn't delved in one specific area of gerontology, but includes psychology, sociology, demography, politics, economics, and there's even a little smidge of biology in there as well. So we've tried to cover most of the basis. But what's also important to Gemma ourselves is pedagogy. And as academics and as teachers, we understand that different people learn in different ways. And it's also really important to have that reinforcement as we learn as well. And most textbooks are a presentation of information, and that's great. But what we thought is, well, we want you to be able to understand your own learning and be able to assess your own learning at the same time. So we've included questions at the end of each of the chapters, activities so that you can continue to expand your own knowledge. And just because we want to give you more bang for your buck as well, we've got an online compendium as well that joins this. So as soon as you purchase the book, you have access to the online resource, which is an extra set of questions, an extra set of readings, etc. And we thought that would be ideal for faculty because they have got a question bank ready for each of the chapters, which enables them to assess learning. Also for students, because they can see where their strengths and their weaknesses lie. And it just means that it provides that supplemental learning in addition, especially in this kind of online environment that we all find ourselves in. It's becoming more and more important to be able to share those resources online. And it's not just a textbook that's going to be for you guys in how you're learning, but it's also been a huge learning experience for both Gemma and myself. So I'm going to turn you over to Gemma to tell you exactly what we have learned.
One of those embarrassing people who forgets to unmute. Thanks, Paul. So I have to say I'm finding today quite a surreal experience, and considering how much of a pleasure it was to write this book with Paul, I found the process of preparing for this launch really, really challenging. I think if it was in normal times, what we'd be is all of the people in the UK and Ireland would be in a kind of an overheated room in the university, and we'd be having some really not very good wine, some canapes from M&S. And at this stage, we'd already all be a little bit sozzled. And the people in California would be doing something similar, but with better wine, better weather, and better canapes. But, and I really thought, you know, the one thing that Paul and I would do really well, whatever about the book, that we would do a really great job at the launch, because we actually are really well known for enjoying a social occasion, both of us. But no, here we are, thanks to coronavirus, on Zoom, together but not quite, kind of excited, feeling a little bit awkward. So considering how worn out we all are by doing things online, we're incredibly grateful that you managed to tune in today. So what I'm going to do is, before I get into the bit that I'm supposed to do, I really want to give out some thanks, because there's no such thing as a book that's just done by the authors or the people whose names are on the front. The first people I want to thank are our publishers, Policy Press. Policy Press are a not-for-profit publisher, not-for-profit publishers, but hard to say. And they work with authors to publish books that are all in their own small way, really trying hard to put a dent in the wing mirror of things like fake news, trolls, big tech. We're all trying to make some kind of difference to the world that we live in. And the passion and the commitment of the staff is really clear in that when you work with them, no matter what your latest excuse, they're always patient. So I really want to thank, first of all, Isabel Bainton, whose idea it was to write this textbook in the first place. But I also then want to thank Laura, Millie, Jess, and the team for keeping us on track the whole way through. There were 2 anonymous reviewers. This is a really, really hard job to do when you're sent a whole manuscript of a book that somebody's written and you're asked to read it in its kind of raw form and give some comments and suggestions as to whether it should be published and how it could be improved. And then there were also 2 copy editors who were people that Policy Press employed, and they picked up all the typos. And if it wasn't for these 4 anonymous individuals, you would be dealing with a book that was full of generalizations, grammatical mistakes, and loads of spellings would be wrong. So really, really big thanks to them. The next thing I want to say is, that's so important to mention, is the British Society of Gerontology. The British Society of Gerontology, I've been a member since about 2008, and Paul for even longer, I think. And it's the absolute best kind of British institution. It is built on the work, either voluntary or poorly paid, of people who are already busy, who sit on a committee. They have a dogged determination and they never ever give up. And you can even still see that today with the important work that they've been doing around campaigning and the treatment of older people during the pandemic. So if you're interested enough in aging to buy this book, I urge you to spend the 50 quid or even less if you're a student to join BSG per annum. There's lots of other people I could mention too, but it really would be too much to go through the whole list. But I will really thank, first of all, Gemma Hodge, who is a very talented artist, whose painting it is we've used on the cover. Apart from being a brilliant artist, Gemma is also an absolutely fantastic friend and all-round brilliant human being. My friend Carmel Duggan has listened to many boring monologues really about me writing this book. And my very good friend and colleague Paula Devine, without whom this launch wouldn't be happening at all. And like many other things that happens with ARC, our research group, they would not be happening if it weren't for Paula Devine. And Dirk Shippets, my other colleague in ARC, and all my colleagues in Queen's and UU who've been patient and supportive listeners and readers of chapters. And lastly, my ace collaborator and now good friend Leonie Hannon, who's taught me to take the long view in aging and who I've really benefited from the conversations with her. I'd also really like to thank my husband, my insanely wonderful sons, Cal and Ray. And the book is dedicated to my dad, who sadly we lost last year. He would have loved to have been here today, even if it was on Zoom. So now I get on to Paul. And it's characteristically generous of Paul Nash to allow me to dedicate our book to my father, because this is what Paul is like. It's this generosity of spirit, his crazy work ethic. It's absolutely insane, his work ethic. And most of all, his absolutely fantastic sense of humor that made working on this book, which took 3 years from writing the proposal to today, such good fun. Paul said it all when we finished the book. He said, it's not amazing that we finished, Gem. What's really amazing is that 3 years after starting writing a book together, we're still friends. And in fact, he even said we're better friends than we were at the start. The pandemic has made me all the more grateful as well for the research trip that I took over to the University of Southern California in November 2018 to work on the book, and of course to attend Drag Queen Bingo in West Hollywood, which was unforgettable. So now the bit I'm supposed to be telling you about, which is the process of writing the book. It was just after we'd finished our desserts, many glasses of wine, and before the Ceilidh had started at the BSG conference in Stirling in Scotland in 2016. And that was the year that Louise McCabe organised the conference, and I'm pretty sure she's still recovering. It was a really big conference. And I think 2016 was a big year for everybody. So this conference happened a few weeks after the Brexit vote. And we also had the spectre of the election of Donald Trump coming down the tracks in the US. So it was kind of dark times, or so we thought. This was before coronavirus. So the pandemic has made me even more grateful, actually, for the opportunity to write this book. All the themes and questions that we discuss and dissect in the book seem suddenly to be really powerful and prescient. So the focus on demographic change, the quality of health of our older populations, questions around the funding, and again, the quality of care for older people, how we use age to discriminate between groups, the need for generations to work together in the pandemic, diversity and inequality within generations of older people. These are all issues that are covered in our book. And also now, in a surreal and shocking way, are the subject of rolling news coverage of coronavirus, a disease that seems to present an existential threat to our older population. So before I drag you all down into my dystopian world, I want to draw your attention to a few more hopeful messages that I think you can take from our book. The first is that solidarity between generations, so that ability of younger and older people to work together for a collective aim, has actually been the mainstay of human societies for centuries, and I don't think this pandemic is going to annihilate it. The second thing we firmly believe is that ageism is an affliction and it's very pervasive, but it is something that can be cured. Education, improved policy making, legislation, adherence to principles of human rights, they're all tools that can be used to protect our older people at this time. Third, not all older people are the same. This is the one message that I think is coming through from the pandemic. And finally, if we don't appreciate the importance of quality of life and we don't understand what it means to live a long life, then it's going to be impossible to convince policymakers that they would have died anyway is not a valid excuse for failing to protect older people during the pandemic. So I know I haven't really given you the plot or substance of the book, but then that's kind of intentional because first of all, I want you to buy it, and second of all, we want you to read it. But also, I really want to give that pleasure to the real experts who are with us today, and these are our students, people who have inspired us to write the book in the first place. Generous as ever with their questions, they've volunteered to read the book and to ask us some more questions, hopefully ones that we can answer without having to look up the index of the book.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Thank you very much, Paul, for giving us that background to the writing of this book. Okay, we're now going to open this up to a bit of a Q&A session. We're not going to be too strict on anyone, and it's not overly formal. Nonetheless, what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to turn to people that I can see first in my Zoom view. There will be no favoritism on that front, I can assure you. And I'll go first to Kerrie Milford, who's the first person I can see here in the top corner of my screen. Kerrie, would you like to ask a question? And please let us know which of the two authors you'd like to direct that question to, or indeed both of them, please.
I suppose this would be more directed towards Gemma because of the work she did with Brexit and the media coverage of it. So we saw how the media jumped on that and kind of created this illusion of a generation war. And my question actually sort of was inspired by my mum, that do you think there's a danger, like either real or imagined, that this is happening with the Green movement, that young people are blaming the older generation for the state that the world is in, basically?
It's very easy to do that, and it's kind of understandable, isn't it? But if you looked at the chapter where we cover that, the opening quote is from the Norwegian group of Grandparents for the Earth, or something they're called. Let me just find it. And they are, they make the point that we owe all children a planet Earth as wonderful as the one we have enjoyed. Norwegian Grandparents Climate Change Campaign. So I think every generation feels that they've kind of inherited some problems from the previous generation. That's actually totally going to be true. But the big problem for the current generation of younger people is that actually the world has changed. It's basically like there was an industrial revolution, you know, a few hundred years ago, but now what you've had is this technological revolution. So the world you've inherited is actually completely different, even from my world, and I'm 45. So there is a danger of blaming the older generation for this, but really, a lot of what we now know about what's happening with climate change is actually fairly recent. And a lot of the damage that has been done is fairly recent. So I would always argue that the way to do it is to see how can you work on it together, like this Norwegian grandparents group are trying to do. It's like not all a lot of older people who, or a lot of environmental activists are older people, you know, people who've been talking about it from the 70s, but it really is only from the 70s. I know you're involved in the Greens, Kerrie, aren't you? Yes. But how long is the ecological movement going? It's quite new, isn't it?
Yeah, I think my mom.
Terms.
Oh, sorry, my mum kind of voiced some like resentment that she feels that kids, you know, sort of look to old people like, oh, you used all these plastics, you like extracted all this oil from the ground, and she was just like, but I didn't know any better.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I think there will be, we see a similar thing happening with the generational gap with the Me Too movement as well, don't we? That things that happened in the past that were socially acceptable are no longer socially acceptable now. So there's always going to be that you know, transition between the generations. There's always going to be that kind of gap that needs to be, gap in experience really, that needs to be kind of bridged.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kerrie. The next person I can see on my screen is Freddie Finlay. Freddie, would you like to ask a question, please? And again, let us know which of the two authors, if not both, you wish to direct it to.
Cheers, Neil. I'd like to direct a question towards Gemma regarding ageism. It's kind of touching on what she's mentioned already. And it's just whether Gemma thinks there's a gap in society between how we actually feel about old people and how we treat older people. Because during the COVID crisis, you've seen Captain Tom Moore kind of celebrated, but then at the same time, you've had high numbers of older people dying unnecessarily in care homes. So do you think there's a little bit of a gap there between how we kind of feel about older people and how we treat older people? Absolutely,
well spotted, Freddie. We should explain to the Americans. Do you know who Captain Tom Moore is, Paul, don't you? Okay, so basically, the others won't know though. At the start of the pandemic, do you want to explain, Freddie? Can you remember it? He set out to do 100 laps of his garden before his 100th birthday, wasn't it?
Yeah.
To raise £1,000 for the NHS. Do you know how much he raised in the end? It was millions and millions, something, I don't know, 20 million or something. So it's just absolutely massive amount of money. And he has become a big hero. He's now got a knighthood, and they're talking about making a film about him with Michael Caine playing the main part. Okay, so so this man is put up as this amazing hero of the pandemic. And he's seen as a veteran, and he's seen as this, you know, everything that is good about English nationalism is personified in Captain Tom Moore. But meanwhile, we've had, you know, 40-odd thousand deaths, and 30,000 or so of those have been in care homes. And they've all been older people, really, apart from a small percentage. So what we're seeing here, Freddie, is a classic case of this kind of often sense you see of the superhero of aging. So we have a general disregard for anybody who's older, or people who are, say, have dementia or in care homes, or people who are dependent, because we see them as slightly subhuman. That's the problem, that we distance ourselves from them. But then we have, but look, you don't have to face this kind of old age is the message. In fact, what you have is the incredible people like Captain Tom Moore. So it's almost like a kind of a split subjectivity, that we have this sense that we don't want to accept the inevitable. Paul, you could probably help me out a bit with what that means about attitudes and things, seeing as the AIR model is really Paul's invention.
Yeah, so really what I would add to that is the dissonance that we have between implicit and explicit attitudes. So explicitly, we all know that ageism is bad. So what we do is we put across that public persona. So when we're talking about someone like Tom Moore, we're saying, oh, it's fantastic, it's excellent. But what we find is that our behavioral outcomes are explicit behavior only drives behavioral outcomes in very planned circumstances, i.e. when you're asked your opinion, when you know it, a bit like the priming that we've had before this session today. We know what we're going to say because we've had that time to think about it. But the implicit attitudes are what drive our unplanned behaviors. And what we find is, especially when we are under extreme levels of cognitive pressure, where we've got lots going on, we've got lots to think about, it's these implicit drivers that are activated. And as we know from the World Health Organization and the research that I've been part of with them, is that implicit ageism is present around the world, throughout societies, even where we see explicitly most people are positive about ageism. And that's really where we see that difference between what we say and what we do. Similarly, as Gemma mentioned, we have the process of othering, where we maximize the differentiation between what we call an in-group and an out-group. So as younger people, we see ourselves as cognitively astute, as fit, as able, etc. And when we other, so we maximize the difference between ourselves as younger people and older people as that out-group. And as such, what we see is then we treat them in different ways, again, to maximize that differentiation because of the gerontophobia, where we basically have this fear of moving into that otherwise stigmatized outgroup.
Very good. Thank you very much for that, Paul. Thank you very much for that, Gemma. The next person I can see on my hit list is Emily Munoz-Snyder. Emily, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. And I suppose this is aimed at both of you, but something I liked about the book was the use of precise egalitarian language when describing older adults and different issues. A term that I've been thinking about lately, and I'm curious about your thoughts on, is elder, distinct from the elderly. Just because I'm under the impression that in some communities it's a very respectful term addressing higher levels of experience, and I'm just wondering what you think of that as an egalitarian term.
Do you want to go, Paul, or will I? I love that term. I've been trying to get that off the ground for years, but it's very hard. But yet the elderly sticks to us all like mud, doesn't it? So, but elderly, and also it gives, there is this group of people, this kind of group of elites at one point who were like, I think it included Mary Robinson, you know, who was a former Irish president who went on to be a UN Commissioner for Human Rights. And I think before he died, Nelson Mandela was on it too. There was like a list of people who were calling themselves the elders. But I just don't think it fits for the lack of respect that there is really for older people, other than within the family. And we do have respect for our elders within the family, you know. So you'll often see that an older person will become granny or will become granddad. It's almost like they only have that identity. And they're no longer a person in their own right, you know, that they're just within the family. So I think it's great and we should all start using it. But I think what we did was what social gerontologists are doing now for years, which is saying older people, which is kind of meaningless too. And did you notice, Emily, at the start of the book, we put in a really clear, we were really kind of honest about the fact that we were not necessarily being precise enough about that, because we don't really believe that chronological age should be used as a definitive indicator of somebody's identity. So we're kind of grappling with those issues all the time, but it'll be up to you now, the next generation of scholars, to start really making elder stick.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd really add to that is looking at the semantics behind it. So you've got elder, which obviously has the positive connotations behind it of wisdom, of expertise, of that respect, whereas elderly has that synonymous connotations with frailty. And that is why I think the field has moved away from elderly towards older people. But elder has a different connotation again. So it's almost like reclaiming the words. So we want to make sure that elder is that positive language that we come to acknowledge that respect, that authority, and reverence in a way. But we almost step away, like we have done, from elderly, until we come to a point where elder, I guess, is much more included in the lexicon that we use on a daily basis. And we steer, like Gemma had mentioned, towards older adults or older people as much more of a neutral, less affective term than obviously using something like elder.
Does anybody in America say seniors? People used to say seniors in America. What does that mean? What's the connotation with seniors?
You know, I'm not certain. I do think, if anything, the connotation errs a little bit more on the negative side. And I personally feel like I see that term a little bit more addressing policy, like who qualifies for certain, levels of, different.
It's like pensioners. We say pensioners in the UK because you have a pension.
We don't really say that here. So that's when I feel like I see the term senior. You also see like senior center for different community centers. But I know in the gerontology program, we tend to steer a little bit away from that.
Good. It's working, Paul. Whatever you're doing, it's working. You're
mute. The next person I can see. Thank you.
I love the way you went, oh, hang on.
Professional. The next person I can see is Amanda Berger. Amanda, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes. Good morning and good afternoon. Congratulations to both of you. Paul, I'm curious, how has living in the US helped you further develop your research as a social gerontologist, and how did this enhance the book as you created it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. To be honest with you, I spent all of my academic life before this in Wales. And I had a fantastic mentor, a couple of mentors in Judith Phillips and Vanessa Berholt. And obviously Gemma Carney.
Just tell them where Wales is, Paul.
So Wales is the bit that sticks out of the west hand coast of England and of the UK. So it's between England and Ireland. And so I spent most of my academic career there before I moved over. And I kind of became very entrenched in the UK way of thinking, and moving over to the US has enabled me to see an awful lot more of the language that's used, the way in which research is conducted. And to be honest with you, I've brought a lot of what I've learned in the UK, including models of co-production for research, over to the US. And also my appreciation of different research methods, so integrating qualitative and quantitative, was something that not necessarily embraced so much in the US. So to be honest with you, what I've done is I've kind of learned a lot more about the systemic approach in the US, and I think that's great. I think the way in which the US approaches certain aspects is fantastic, and also the way in which I've been embraced as well. So most of my research has been around aging and ageism. So I've found that I can apply that to different areas. So as a little bit of a nod, yesterday I got the acknowledgement that I've just been voted in as a commissioner for the LA Commission on HIV as one of their aging specialists. So it's just shown that there's so many areas, because LA especially is so huge and America even bigger, there's so many opportunities to apply what we've learned in practical contexts. And that's something which I've thoroughly embraced, and I think is reflected well in the book, because we've been able to give examples from around the world, not just from the UK and the US, but also examples from our work and our experience around the world. So in Australia and New Zealand and India, etc. We've just been able to try and apply this to show you there are differences in different areas around the world.
Can I come in on that as well, Neil? Yeah, because one of the things, do you remember, Paul, as well, what was really great, and I think the trip over for me to go to California was really useful as well, because then I could see both sides, which you already had that perspective, of course, because you'd been in the UK. And I think it really made us think about the language, didn't it? Particularly around race, because there's very different, acronyms and terms used to describe people of color or BAME or black or lots of different ways to describe people. So we had to have, and this may be a bit why, as Emily says, we used, we're very careful about language. And I think that might have been one thing about being international co-authors, is that you really had to try and write as inclusively as possible so that everybody could understand it. And I also think it made the book way, way better in terms of being relevant to a broader audience, because it would have been too easy to stay in our comfort zone and just use examples that were, only relevant to UK.
Yeah,
very good.
Just one quick thing. I just think, again, the example of that is also, it's made it much more saleable on both sides, because there are huge differences between the UK and US, but there are also huge similarities. So I think what we've been able to do is draw on those differences, draw on our own experiences, and hopefully make something that we find is applicable. So UK gerontologists aren't thinking about just working in the UK, and US gerontologists aren't thinking about just working in the US, but really giving it that wider global flavor.
Thank you very much, Paul. We can throw this open a little bit wider now for more questions from the floor, although obviously this being Zoom, you are on your own floor and it is your own. You can either come in and ask us a question directly via Paula Devine, who is our Zoom host for today, or if you prefer, you can send through the chat function a question directly to me and I will ask the authors for you. So who would like to step up first and ask a question? Do we have any takers? Are people typing? Paula, can you let us know if anybody wants to come in and ask a question at this point?
Can I ask one?
Of course you can. Yes, absolutely. Going back to Kerrie Milford. Kerrie, what would you like to ask?
So the University of Ulster here in Northern Ireland has recently started a fast-track medical degree that can be completed within 4 years if you come from a social science background. And I was just kind of wondering, do you think that much progress has been made in the medical profession in terms of kind of social gerontology kind of views of aging, or do you think there's still a long way to go?
That's such a good question, Kerrie. Can I come back on that first, Paul? Do you know where you see how little progress has been made? And the thing that's frustrated us all as social gerontologists is during the pandemic, the rule of over 70. So there's this rule, you know, in the UK, most of the world is that anybody who's over a certain age, and they generally pick a fairly young age, like 70, and say that you're then at risk, which is a real kind of medical interpretation of what it is to be older. Because of course, there's lots and lots of people who are under 70 who may be at risk because they could have underlying conditions, and lots of older people who are much more vulnerable. So the people who actually ended up dying in the first wave should have been super protected. So the people who were living in care homes, for instance. So other things that we know are really important to social scientists, things like, do you live in a communal setting or not? You know, are you likely to suffer from loneliness? Are you bereaved? Do you have enough money? All these different things that we take into account are taken into an account to a certain extent by medics, but not in the same way. I think particularly not in terms of designing big public health strategies like we've seen. So if social scientists had been at the table at the start of the pandemic, we might have had more nuanced and better policies that would have saved a lot of older people from loneliness and would have saved many other older people's lives.
Yeah, I kind of echo what you're saying there. And I think actually, Kerrie, your nuanced language in there was fantastic, because what you've got is the difference in terms of social scientists, because the medical profession medicalizes aging. So you're looking at geriatrics rather than gerontology. And as Gemma said, if we included gerontologists, then actually we start to look at what older people can do rather than the losses associated with aging. And that's really important. And to be honest, I've seen that mirrored in terms of what happens in the US. So for example, one of the lowest paid fields as a medical professional is geriatrics. So not very many people are wanting to go into that field, let alone actually educate themselves further in there. Similarly, what we find is the only subspecialism that you don't have to take as training as a clinician in the US is geriatrics. Yet most of the people who they're going to be treating, unless you're a pediatrician, are going to be older adults. So we find this real big disconnect. But I think the key thing you're saying is, and by no means are we saying that medics are bad, because without them, so this could have been a whole lot worse. But what we're saying is there needs to be other people at the table as well. And I think having that accelerated program for social scientists is fantastic. So some of the best nurses and some of the best doctors I've ever met have come from a gerontology and psychology backgrounds.
Now, we are getting some questions in on the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen if you point your mouse downwards. And the first one that's come up on my feed is from Yvonne Galligan, who we might refer to as something of a friend of the show. What are the author's thoughts on intergenerational friendship, not family-based, but friendship as a network, and one that is both equitable and mutually respectful? There can be an imbalance in attitude between generational friends.
I love that question, but the person who's actually much more qualified to answer that question is also here, but she's not an author of this book, and that is Catherine Elliott O'Dare. So I will send you on some of her work afterwards, Yvonne. But actually, I know what Catherine found from her work is that intergenerational friendships were extremely, she did a study of intergenerational friends, And specifically in the same way as you mentioned, they're not family networks, friends. And what she found was that both parties really benefited from it because it did actually expand their network. But also, I think what she found as well is that giving older people connections and networks with people who aren't their peer group, as you get older, that's really important. And to have some friends outside your family, because you want to be, because basically, of course, one of the things that happens, as we mentioned in the book, is that your co-biographers die off, as Gunhild Hagestad used to always said, so that the people who are in your own generation die off. This is the natural process of getting older, and that it's very important to have younger friends. So it is a big benefit. I always cultivate a few younger friends. I know you do too, Yvonne.
Yeah, I see. It's also really important in terms of sharing histories as well. So some of the best ways in which we actually learn from previous generations is through that intergenerational contact, and we pass stories down. So we talk about shared experience, and we do that in terms of, as Kerrie mentioned before, in terms of activism. So activism didn't start 5 years ago. It's been going on for generations, and we pass on that shared knowledge of what works, what doesn't work, on shared stories. So that kind of intergenerational contact is really important. And from my soapbox of ageism, it's incredibly important to actually counter some of these negative stereotypes on aging, but both sides, because ageism cuts both ways. Not all young people are hoodie wearing slobs, and not all old people are shuffling around with walking sticks. So actually, by fostering these intergenerational relationships that are outside of the family network, we can just see how false some of these perpetuated stereotypes really are.
Now, we are coming towards the end of this session, but I think we have time for one more question, which has just come in on the chat from Rob Fountain. And it's this: does the existence of charitable organisations focused on age actually reinforce ageism through a sort of compassionate ageism, or do they have a part to play in championing a more positive societal response to ageing?
Well, do you know what I'd love to, who is it, Alex, is it?
No, sorry, that question came from Rob Fountain.
Rob, really good question, Rob. And it's something that I have wondered about for years, and it is something that we cover a little bit in the book. But basically what I would say is that we do this in all, charities line up with how we organize policy. So we tend to have children's charities because we have child benefit and children's rights, and we see children as a particular group. Then we tend to have charities that align with, say, the unemployed or homeless people who are adults. Then we have charities that align with pensioners. And this is actually a function of how our welfare state works and a function of how we deliver services. And that's how the charities just follow that, because then they often start by trying to call for better pensions, for instance. So they can, in the sense that we all can. I mean, gerontologists can do this, but my favorite activist movement, I think, was the Grey Panthers, which was set up by Maggie Kuhn on the basis of her, after she retired, she was an American and she was a civil rights activist. And after she retired from her job in the civil service, she had to take in some lodgers who were younger people. And with them, she started this movement of the Grey Panthers, which was actually a movement for intergenerational kind of equality and civil rights and things for everyone. So actually the best activist movements are ones that are more inclusive, and the ones that do include. And of course, feminism is another example of an intergenerational movement. So there's lots of, you know, I think sometimes the very oldest people get shuffled into a particular category, and that is what you're talking about maybe, but I think there is plenty of representation of people who are older in other groups as well. So it used to be something that I worried about more, but I don't so much now. But I do think we should organise policy, not in these silos. We should organise policy for the life course, not just for children, and then adults, and then older people, like they're all completely separate, not just one person moving through the life course.
So the only other thing I would kind of add to that is we have to be kind of careful. We walk at almost a fine line as an organisation who might be advocating for older adults' needs. So, for example, we know that there's need for a campaign to combat loneliness, but we don't want to paint all older adults as lonely. We know that we need to have falls prevention awareness, but we don't want to paint all older adults as frail people who fall down. So what we've got to do as organizations is make sure we're using representations as well. So we have these campaigns, but we need to, again, demedicalize necessarily all of the messages that we're saying. So we're actually looking at the benefits. So for example, you might want to, Lord, today is being the International Day of Older People. Let's celebrate something like that. Let's celebrate the diversity of aging. Let's not just say that all older people require support. Some of the best and biggest activists are technically older people. So
yeah,
we have to.
Jane Fonda's been a great example at the moment. Yeah, good point, Paul.
So what we're saying, and it's one of the things that we're doing, we did within the BSG, so the British Society of Gerontology, when we looked at images of aging. Images are massively important. If, as an organization, you put out stereotyped images of aging, you can reinforce those negative portrayals of older people. If we actually start to put across more reflective and more realistic images of older people, we can start to counteract that. So I understand that some charities, for example, need to highlight the challenges facing older people because they need to bring in more money so they can continue this active work. There's that kind of fine line between making sure we're being advocates, but also making sure that we're not portraying older adults as a homogenous, unable group. So we're giving people who don't have a voice, but also enabling older people to come to the table themselves, because who knows aging best? It's certainly not Gemma and myself, it's older people who've lived it.
Well, unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time here. I know several of you have asked questions that sadly we're not going to get to, but I have saved them and I will present them to the authors and they might respond in their own time. It only remains for me to give out a few thanks to some very important people. First and foremost, the two authors of the book, Critical Questions for Aging Societies, Gemma Carney and Paul Nash. Thank you also to Paula Devine, who organised all of this for us today. Thank you to our panellists, Kerrie, Freddie, Emily and Amanda. Thank you very much to Policy Press for publishing the book in the first place and also for being so helpful to the authors in all of their endeavours. And thank you, of course, to all of you who took the time out of your schedules to log on today to come and join us on Zoom to ask some questions and to experience the launch of this excellent new book. Thank you to everybody who participated and hopefully we will see you all very, very soon. Stay safe, everyone, and goodbye.